Hmm. So, greetings, everyone. My name is Renee Bryce Laporte. I'm the Director of Membership Services at Apprenticeships for America. AFA is a nonprofit dedicated to the goal of increasing the number of registered apprenticeships in the United States, improving practice on the ground, and advocating for the field. Please mute your phones, friend. Um, and that advocacy piece is going to be particularly important in the near future as we have a new administration coming into the White House, a new and old administration coming into the White House. We have a new secretary coming into the Department of Labor, and we'll have a new Congress in session as well. So we're going to want to know what our opportunities are, where are the challenges going to be, what relationships we need to build, which ones we need to grow and foster, and how we might work cooperatively towards our common purposes. Um, in that spirit, we have a special guest with us today, our policy consultant, Chris Andresen of the Duco Group here in Washington, D.C. Before we dive into their conversation, there are a couple of things that I'd like to mention quickly. Some of you may have heard that we are hosting a summit, a conference next month. The AFA Summit will be held February 5th and 6th with pre-conference sessions on the 4th at Gallaudet University, the Kellogg Conference Center and Hotel. Please note that the space is limited. And for those of you coming from out of town, our summit location, the Kellogg Conference and Hotel, does have lodging. And so please make a reservation. We look forward to having many of you there. Also want to note that this conversation is being recorded, as I mentioned before. We'll distribute the recording to all who've registered for this webinar within the next day or two. So without any further ado, I'd like to go into starting to talk to Chris. Thank you for your patience. Chris, thank you so much for joining us. I know there's plenty for us to talk about with, again, new but old administration taking office this month. And while we want to hear from you about the leadership changes and their implications for us in workforce and apprenticeship, and the policy opportunities there and the challenges ahead, it might be good for our audience to hear a little bit about you. Could you just tell us a little bit? We want to know a little bit about the person speaking to us. Tell us a little bit about your firm and how you ended up there and how you came to be interested in apprenticeship and focused in on that. Could you talk to us a little bit about that?
Yes, thanks, Renee, and welcome everybody. I see some familiar names and faces, but it's also good to be exposed to a newer, wider audience. As Renee said, my name is Chris Andresen. I've been working with Apprenticeships for America for probably a little bit over a year now. I'm a lobbyist based in Washington, D.C. I started working on workforce development policy sort of right around the time when WIOA was authorized in 2014. So, let's just call it 10 years. And that was on a sort of a kind of a reentry diversion type program, which was really interesting because the woman that was leading the foundation had formerly been a teacher in prison. And she
Oh,
said in
wow.
one of her classrooms, she looked up and she had a mother and then the daughter was pregnant in her prison classroom. And she said there were three generations of this family in prison. She said that was a cycle that she really wanted to break. That was a story that sort of uh, connected with me as something like this is just wrong. Breaking that. We hear a lot about cycles around whether it's prison, whether it's poverty, and so that was sort of where I got my start on the policy side of this. And then at the time, WIOA was being negotiated, and fast forward. Obviously, we can talk about it, Renee. We just had sort of
Sure.
another sort of negotiation and fast-paced end of the year as it related to workforce development policy. But so that sort of initial experience has led me to work with a number of different clients, including Apprentices for America, on some of the more innovative aspects, I would think, around workforce development, which to me is captivating. But it also, I think, on the policy side, on the congressional side, the administrative side, that's where a lot of the energy seems to be
Hmm.
um, when it comes to policy and this sort of broader conversation. The firm that I'm working in, Ducco Government Relations has been around for about 40 years. I've been here for about 20 years. Um, Bipartisan, sort of entrepreneurial, really a great place to work. And we've done a lot of work over the years as it relates to higher education, workforce development. And so, one of the things I always say, it's a double-edged sword. Workforce development touches and education touch everything, every
Everything.
issue. It
Yeah.
doesn't matter what. And so really a lot of it comes down to, okay, let's on any particular thing, let's focus on the impact of workforce development on this particular piece. Um,
Mm.
so, and that's taken us a lot of different places, which has been really fun. And I'll say one of the better parts of the job is, I sort of say jokingly, good ideas don't come from DC. I have to leave, then get the idea and come back in. And so I've been able to, attend a lot of different meetings and get to know a lot of people doing work, whether it's an apprenticeship, workforce development on the ground, and seeing it in action. To me, has been really special. So that's been a lot of fun too, growing up through that.
Great. Thank you very much for that. I think it's always good for folks to get a little bit of understanding of the background of the person there in front of them. So, can we turn to Congress for a minute? In this most recent election cycle, the House remained in Republican hands and the Senate flipped, and it's now also in Republican hands. And even while the House has remained in GOP hands, all of the leadership of the committees, the key committees that affect education, workforce, and apprenticeship, have flipped. Could you just review those for us and tell us who's who and how this has changed?
Absolutely. Yeah, Congress is an interesting place. It has been, and it certainly will be for this session. So, as you mentioned, going through the election, now we do have a new Congress seated. Of course, we're in the sort of the waning days of the Biden administration. President-elect Trump gets inaugurated on Monday. Probably the most open-ended question when it comes to leadership, Renee, coming into the session was who would the Speaker of the House be, right? Mike Johnson, kind of inherited the position during the last session. I think we all watched 2 years ago with uh, a lot of interest when it
Interest,
was
yes.
17, 18 rounds of votes for Kevin McCarthy to become elected Speaker. And then, of course, he was um, he was removed from that position. And given some of the tumult, again, that did include workforce development at the end of last year as it related to Mike Johnson. It was sort of a question of what kind of support does he have within the conference. You mentioned the House, on the Republican side, they did hold the majority, but it's 220 to 215 right now. That's going to change with some resignations with people going into the administration. But essentially, the speaker vote is instructive of what this Congress is going to look like because he can essentially lose when you're fully, staffed up. 218 is the majority in the House. So you have the ability to maybe lose one vote. And that's, of course, assuming everybody's in attendance, which with 435 people doesn't happen very often. I think
Right.
one percentage I saw when that happened, like over the last several Congresses, it was in the single digits, right?
Yeah.
So the margin for error is thin, but in order for Mike Johnson to be reelected, he could only lose one vote. So it wasn't 18 rounds this time, Renee, but there was a little bit of drama with some people holding out, changing their vote. The president-elect making some phone calls to get those holdouts to change their vote for Speaker Johnson. But again, I think that shows how this next Congress is going to play out.
So can you paint for folks, when you have that narrow majority, what does that mean in terms of what policy has to look like to get past the goalie?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, again, so I mentioned 218 is the magic number. I've always said there's one rule in the House, that is majority rules, right? And so you can, if you think about, and I don't, we'll talk about Republicans for a second, but certainly it exists on the Democrat side as well. There are different, factions within each conference, different viewpoints and positions. The one that gets talked about most frequently on the Republican side, in the House is the Freedom Caucus. And so, again, you saw this play out when it came to the continuing resolution and appropriations at the end of last year. The Freedom Caucus, typically you're more conservative Republican. They don't generally support appropriations bills, when that fund the government. And so if the Freedom Caucus is say 30 to 40 members, if you can't rely, and again, your margin, Renee, like you said, is 1 to 2 votes, let's call it, 3 or 4. If that's your margin, but you're talking about a segment of your conference that may not vote with you, where does that leave you? That means you have to negotiate with Democrats. And that was some of the issue that, that's what sort of cost Kevin McCarthy his speakership. Certainly that was a problem at the end of last Congress, but I will say, Speaker Johnson sort of continuing that post, it's sort of an impossible position, right? You're navigating all those different viewpoints. And so when you mention policy, you have to get 218 members to agree to something. That's really difficult. Right?
Yeah.
It just is, whether you're the same party or not. And so on the upside, if you're looking at 218 and your upside is 220, that's like your top number. There's not a lot of upside there. But
Yeah.
if you have the wherewithal to be able to negotiate with Democrats, well, they have 215. So you can see there's a lot more upside there. Now, politically speaking, that can be a dangerous proposition, right? Is negotiating with Democrats, potentially giving them things that, again, part of your conference doesn't like in order to, in this case, keep the government open or fund the government for a fiscal year. And so those are the types of things that leadership has to deal with. And again, we have these deadlines that, you're sort of right under the gun, things happen. Obviously, we've seen now the influence of, whether it be Elon Musk himself or just X and Twitter as a platform on some of these actions. But, this idea that, again, Republicans do have the trifecta, the White House, the House, and the Senate. They do have an extremely narrow margin in the House for sure. And so navigating that is difficult, especially when you have very lofty goals when it comes to taxes, spending, these sorts of things that traditionally for Republicans have been difficult issues. And so,
Now, Chris, should I ask, and I don't want to stay here too long, but
right,
with
we could.
we could, but with workforce policy and apprenticeship in particular, there tends to be a decent amount of bipartisan support. We're not talking about the HB1 visas or funding for diversity initiatives or gun control or something that's going to be really hot button in that way, really divisive. So
Sure.
some hope.
Yes, that's what I have to operate on, Renee, is some hope. But I will say, when you look back to 2014 with WIOA, when it passed 10 years ago, I think there were 9 no votes collectively between the House and the Senate.
Gotcha.
And I'll say that historically for workforce development, that's been where it is as an issue. In the past, the previous session, the Stronger Workforce for America Act passed the House. It ultimately didn't pass Congress, but it passed the House with like 300 and I want to say 385, 386 vote, very strong vote.
Decisive.
The only people that voted against it were Freedom Caucus members, right? So you did have a bipartisan proposal and approach, and I think part of that is just drilling right down to the foundation of that is every single member of Congress hears from businesses pretty much every day, every week about how they don't have access to enough workers, enough talent, and what could be in their company, in their industry, in their community if they did. And so that really creates that unifying presence around the issue. Now, look, to your point, Renee, can people, especially here in DC, find something to disagree about? Absolutely. But at its core, at a premise, I think workforce development is one of those truly bipartisan issues that most members of Congress, especially now we talked about turnover this recent election, Renee, a lot of members now, especially in the House,
Uh-huh.
never voted on WIOA, right? They're new. I mean,
They're
10
new
years
to
is a
it.
long time. There's been a lot of turnover, especially recently. And so I would venture to say close to 75 to 80% of the members in the House never voted on WIOA. So they don't have that sort of institutional legislative muscle memory as it comes to workforce development policy, right? And so
Gotcha.
I think that's, to some of your opening remarks, to me, that's where the opportunity lies for an organization like Apprenticeships for America. If we're talking specifically about apprenticeships and that model as being so kind of the gold standard as it relates to job training and employment. That's certainly something where we have the ability to help educate these members as to what's happening based on the information, like you said, member services from that we get as AFA from our members to let them know this is how we're working within our organization and our affiliates and our members to address this problem, again, specifically drilling down on apprenticeship in this case.
So to be real quick about it, can you just tell folks who the actual heads of the committees are that affect apprenticeship?
Sure. Absolutely. Yeah, I got kind of sidetracked there. So,
That's okay.
Education and Workforce Committee, again, staying in Republican hands, is now being led by Tim Walberg, who's a congressman from Michigan, longstanding member of the committee. He's one of those members that actually voted on WIOA. I think
Mhm.
he's entering either his 10th or 11th term, so he's been in Congress for a little while. His district spans sort of the bottom part of Michigan. And he's stated that workforce development apprenticeships specifically are key priorities for him as chairman. He hasn't been chair of the committee. It's something that he looked at last Congress, didn't get it, came back this Congress. He was selected there. The ranking member remains Bobby Scott from Virginia, who was the ranking member last Congress and the chair of the Congress before, as far as that goes. So Bobby Scott's sort of been around, a strong supporter, I would say, around apprenticeships and has a long history of supporting, especially funding for apprenticeships and some of the policies. He's been a leader on like the apprenticeship, the National Apprenticeship Act reauthorization, for instance.
And
On the
there's a
Senate
lot of
side,
apprenticeship in his district, I hear.
correct. Yeah,
Yeah.
he represents, he's down in the Hampton Roads or Newport News area. So sort of a big defense industrial base, certainly, but something that he's very passionate about. So he's been a longstanding champion on these issues. On the Senate side, you have sort of the same faces, but in different places. So Bill Cassidy from Louisiana now is the chair of the HELP committee, the Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions Committee on the Senate side. He had been the ranking member. That was a new post for him last session. He's a physician by training, but I think that he took a particular interest, especially on the apprenticeship side, early on last Congress. Maybe had the opportunity to meet with some young apprentices from Louisiana, which is
Hmm.
his state, and so hopefully that'll be somebody else that we can work with. And then Bernie Sanders, who again had been the chairman of the committee last session, is now continuing on as the ranking member. As you said, with a new Congress, the organizational vote piece with the rank and file members of the committee is now being finalized. Actually, the Ed and Workforce Committee on the House side has its organizational meeting tomorrow, where they'll go
Hmm.
through and make their subcommittee assignments and get all that finalized. But from a leadership standpoint, some similar voices. But of course, the biggest change probably will be that Tim Walberg is now chair of the committee. He's replacing Virginia Fox, who had led the committee for Republicans for 8 years. She actually got a waiver to serve longer than their usual 6. So she was a long time member of the committee, still on the committee. And actually now she's going to chair the Rules Committee, which is an important post within
Hmm.
on the House side. And then on the Senate side, of course, with Republicans now coming back in to the majority, having Bill Cassidy there in that role, on the help committee will be sort of a much different feel, as you could imagine, right? I think a lot of folks, whether you're from Vermont or not, probably more familiar with Bernie Sanders politics than your average senator, just based on his history and profile. I will say Bill Cassidy, though, over his career, is somebody who's more in line with a deal maker, right? He's a Republican that voted for the bipartisan infrastructure law. He voted for the Chips and Science Act. He's somebody sort of a more practical legislator on some of these topics, which again, I think for all of our purposes, when you think about the lead Republican on the House side, sort of pulling out apprenticeships as kind of a key point for him, and then having Bill Cassidy there on the Senate side, perhaps that's an opportunity to again continue working with those offices on these issues.
And to his credit, I used to live near the Capitol. I'd see him every once in a while, and he was very nice to my dog. So I'm going to give him credit
You
for
can
that.
tell a lot about people, Renee, how they treat pets, their pets, and other people's pets.
Yeah. So on the administration side, we're going to have a new Secretary of Labor, and we're going to have a return to the White House of Donald Trump.
Hmm.
And so anything that you see there in terms of personnel and sort of policy things that we should be keeping our eyes on.
Absolutely. I do think that the economic plan for the incoming administration, for the Trump administration, and then also that connects to the congressional discussion that we can talk about too. A lot of it's gonna rely on this idea of strengthening the American sort of manufacturing base. You hear a lot about, well, we want things to be made here again. Some of that, again, there'll be a focus on the policy side, on taxes, but I do think that there will be, and as you know, Renee, we're talking to some members about this now. There will be an emphasis on the workforce side as well, because that's clearly been a bottleneck across many industries for several years. And so, if your economic plan, again, from the Trump perspective, relies on more jobs and more companies returning, coming to the U.S., or onshoring some of these jobs, well, you got to have a skilled and trained workforce to get that done. And of course, obviously, from our perspective, we're going to be pitching apprenticeship as one of those key elements. But you mentioned on the policy side and so the personnel side, the nominee for Secretary of Labor is a former Congresswoman from Oregon named Lori Chavez DeRemer. She's a former mayor out there in Oregon. Served one term in the House, lost her reelection. She was on the Education and Workforce Committee, but sort of an interesting kind of background and potential policy positions. And I think this is something that, again, in the Senate's role of looking at these nominees, they're wondering about is last Congress. She was one of only a few Republicans who supported and introduced something called the PRO Act, which is labeled as sort of a pro-union bill, but that's just sort of a broad brush. But you would think typically, again, and maybe there's nothing typical, Renee, about what we're looking at here. Typically, a Republican labor secretary nominee doesn't have, those close ties to unions. That being said, I think politically speaking, you look at this most recent election, and you can see that there are a lot of rank and file union members that were sort of shifting to the Trump Republican ballot from that sense. And so I think that you're seeing some of that reflected in these nominees. Now, again, in the Senate's role, they can question the former Congresswoman about that. But again, I think important for this group too. And again, we didn't have as many Republican co-sponsors, but she was one of the co-sponsors for the National Apprenticeship Act reauthorization measure as well, which ultimately didn't pass Congress, but it was a bill that would significantly scale apprenticeships to a level that we've never seen before, right? And again, these are proposed levels, but it would nearly triple the amount of authorized funding for apprenticeships over 5 years. So that's a significant piece for us to think about when it comes to, her as a nominee, as potential Secretary of Labor. Look, in the grand scheme of things, right? she is non-controversial. I mean, we've hopefully been through the most controversial nominees. We'll see. But I think that there will be some questions asked of some of her positions that she took when she was a congresswoman. But ultimately, having somebody in that position that understands and supports these broader sort of apprenticeship issues, being a mayor, having some of that local background, I think can help too. And then ultimately, what does she do in that post if she gets confirmed? Now, she is meeting with Republicans and Democrats on the help committee, and typically the Secretary of Labor position is not one of the first allegate to be confirmed, but it's possible that she could be confirmed by let's just say by this time next month, right? So in the next 4 weeks, she could have a hearing, they could have a vote on her in committee, and then they could have a vote on her floor, assuming everything were to go well. And then, like you said, Renee, then you get to filling out some of those other positions, assistant secretary for ETA. And I will say, again, maybe it's lessons learned, but if you look at who the president nominated in 2016 for his labor secretary, that was Andy Pudzer, who came from corporate America, and like he couldn't make it through Senate confirmation, right? And so now you have a much different, and so that delayed the DOL nominee for a little while. I mean, I don't think we had an assistant secretary at ETA for at least 18, 24. So it was a while before some of these things got filled out. And so that will also be important. But I think, getting the secretary in place then allows some of those other positions potentially to be filled along the way.
So, picture that you're painting is it seems like if things go the way that they most likely will, we will have folks from different parties there, but folks who may be able to work together and work with us. So, are there any legislative vehicles that advocates and practitioners should be monitoring? What should we be looking for coming out of there? And do you think those things have a chance?
Yeah, the first, I think Republicans in the House and the Senate, and certainly the president, and this is not unique to President Trump, but any presidential term, from Biden as a one-term president to, President Trump the last time, and then President Obama, your first year, right, is where you expend a lot of your political capital on legislative issues, right? So if you think about the early years of President Obama's term, it was Obamacare. If you think about the first year of President Trump's first term, it was tax cuts. If you think about President Biden, they had the American Rescue Plan, and they had the Inflation Reduction Act, and then of course you had the infrastructure law and some other things too. And so I think for this, if we're just looking at this year, Renee, if you think about what those vehicles may be. Clearly, the biggest thing you're going to hear about, and again, I think there is some connection to a workforce conversation to be had, especially even on apprenticeships, like some of the conversations we're having, is on taxes, right? So the right out of the bat, right? And again, it's going to take a little while. There's some process that has to happen, procedure. The Republicans are going to be focused on extending some of the Trump era tax cuts that are slated to expire at the end of this year. So that's very time sensitive. Then there's going to be some energy elements to that. There's going to be some immigration elements to that. There may be some defense elements to that. Now, of course, we've got these horrifying, terrifying wildfires in California. Some additional disaster aid that may still be hanging out there from last Congress related to the hurricanes and storms in the Southeast. The debt limit, right? These are all really difficult issues to navigate from a funding perspective, but also from a political perspective. And that's why we were alluding to, Renee, at the top. Yes, Republicans have this trifecta, and historically that has allowed the party in control of that trifecta to accomplish big things. But it's going to be really difficult, right? We saw the difficulties that last Congress had just just passing a continuing resolution to fund the government for 3 months. Now, by the way, we're 2 months away from that. It's been a month. It's already been a month since that happened. But when you think about what you're hearing on the policy side, the legislative vehicle that maybe end up being out there is a budget reconciliation package. And important for everyone on this call to know is that is a vehicle that only requires a simple majority vote in the Senate, right? So it requires 50 votes. Republicans have 53 seats in the Senate. I will say, back to the conversation about makeup and rank and file, Renee, I think this is the most numbers of new senators. I think by the time there's been a couple that are nominated to the administration that will be replaced, I think we're looking at 14 new senators, which is the most we've seen in about 15 years. So again, more opportunity. But in order to use that fast track procedure that allows you to bypass the 60 vote legislative threshold, typically for a filibuster, there are rules around what can be considered in that vehicle, right? So you're not going to see a situation where a WIOA reauthorization bill is considered via reconciliation, because policy is not eligible for that. That's subject to the 60 vote threshold in the Senate for a filibuster. So it has to be taxes and spending, the debt limit, and then mandatory spending items. Think Social Security, Medicaid, Medicare, things like that. Now, again, we talked about some of the political pitfalls, especially for Republicans. If you want to extend Trump tax cuts, that's, again, from a ledger standpoint, that's fewer revenues coming into the federal government. So there's a cost associated with that.
Mm-hmm.
And again, we don't know exactly what that looks like from a vehicle set, but what that amounts to is about $4 to $5 trillion in reduced revenues to the federal government over 10 years. In order to balance that, Republicans are going to be looking for changes to existing spending, existing programs to make up for some of those changes, right? And so you think about, you've already heard a lot about work requirements for the Medicaid population, things like that. Again, we're not talking about your run-of-the-mill discretionary apprenticeship program cuts. These are much bigger sort of programmatic mandatory spending pieces, and important to remember that's based on the rules for reconciliation, right?
Gotcha.
And so what we've seen in the past, especially as it relates to apprenticeship, we saw this in the Inflation Reduction Act, was a federal tax credit for employers in the renewable energy space that they could apply as they were using registered apprenticeships in that space. They would then get a tax credit for those employees from the federal government. So you could see something like that in the apprenticeship space. But one of the other pieces too, and again, with the Republicans crafting this bill, it looks a lot different than your more recent reconciliation. But if you go back and look at the Inflation Reduction Act, it's a lot of spending in programs, which is not something that Republicans are focused on doing. If you look at when they did the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act in 2017, that was strictly a tax bill, right? They didn't have really any of the ancillary stuff on it. Now they're talking about energy and immigration, but sometimes those policies get taken off of these bills because they don't pass the rules to use the reconciliation process. So that's the big vehicle, Renee, that's going to take up a lot of time. And again, there's going to have to be a lot of negotiation with the administration and with Congress, with Republicans amongst themselves, because again, they can pass this by themselves, but they have to get essentially everybody to agree to it. That's difficult. But I will say for us, and I know we can get to this, but as on the apprenticeship side, on the advocate side, I think it's important for us to recognize that from a tax perspective, from a policy perspective, when it comes to immigration, these things like that, these all have impacts to the labor market, to jobs, to certain industries. And I think what companies will then be asking for as well will be some help on the workforce, the worker side. And I think that's where apprenticeships do come in as a viable option for discussion here, right? Across the board. So we'll see how those two things, Renee, play off of each other.
Gotcha.
But it's going to be an interesting discussion.
So, Chris, thank you for that. I'm looking at the clock. We have about 24 minutes left here. Oh, no, I just giving us a time check. I want to ask you a couple of questions, and folks are starting to put questions in the chat, which we welcome. So I'm going to try to work through these. Given some of the length of time it's going to take to get legislation on apprenticeship through, maybe just ask how might advocates and practitioners work towards establishing relationships, not just with Congress, but also with the administration, with DOL, to help create policy that'll be beneficial to the field?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a great question, great point. I mean, I would say I'm going back to my poli-sci days, which one of our professors would say all politics is local. And I would say what has been powerful for me as an advocate or as a professional has been seeing some of these programs in action. And so what I would say is don't be shy about inviting, whether it's the member of Congress or their district staff, depending on where you are, to come see some of the programs that you're running, see some of the businesses that are using and hiring apprentices. Let them see what's happening on the ground, because we get caught up in a lot of these macro numbers that don't really, I mean, I just said, extending text, it's going to cost $5 trillion. I don't know what that means or looks like. It's just a number on a page with a lot of zeros. But if you can show somebody in a manufacturing facility that you've hired 5 apprentices and they're going through this program, they have no debt, they're gaining these skills, and then there's a career path when they get out from that program, and you've engaged with the local community, training providers, I saw community colleges. That is much more connective than some number on a page. And so I think that goes for any level of government, whether it's federal, state, local. And I would always say, and again, I'm sort of working with staff all these years, never discount the impact that having a staffer come visit a program or something can have, especially as it relates to that trickling up the chain to the boss. That's what people are really looking for. As these folks get elected and they're trying to understand, okay, maybe I've heard about apprenticeship. What does that mean in my community? How do I connect with it? Who's running these programs? Who's it benefiting? That should be our faces and our names
Yeah.
in their inbox, so they can say, okay, when I'm back home, I want to go look at what's happening here. I need to call Renee because he's going to be connected to these different initiatives. And I would say too, again, there's going to be a lot of things sort of settle out at DOL. We'll see how that works, but I know that under this current administration, current for the next 6 days, there's been some empowerment on the regional side. And again, you've got sort of central HQ. You do have these regional offices, but just again, connecting with people and helping them understand how this gets put in action on the ground, I think is the best thing we can do now and in the future. Because, I mean, for those that were involved at the end of last Congress when it came to WIOA and this Stronger Workforce for America, there was all this action and momentum within the span of 72 hours. But a lot sort of built up to that, right? Helping people understand the impact of policies, what was happening. And so I would say doing that on the front end, because you never know when you're going to get the apprenticeship legislative burst, right? It might come in May or it might come in November. But if we've done some of that work up front to help educate folks, expose them to apprentices and programs, then that makes that burst a lot more. It burns hotter, right away. And so I think that that's really what we're looking at now, Renee. Maybe without a specific focus on a legislative vehicle, but
Hmm.
with a broader sort of kind of educational and awareness campaign, so that when that burst happens, we can sort of fuel
You're
the
you're
fire
you're
behind it
well
when it comes to apprenticeship, you
you're
know?
well positioned. I'm going to add a quick amen and then turn to the questions there. Fun fact, years ago, I used to do what you do for a nonprofit doing anti-poverty work. And certainly one of the most effective things we did was to help staffers understand what we were doing and how it worked to the benefit of the member that they were representing, be they Democratic or Republican, and handing that staffer information so that they can look smart in front of your boss. It sort of guarantees that they'll come back to you because they know that you're somebody that's knowledgeable and you're going to help them look good. So that's my amen. I've got 3 or 4 questions that are in the chat here. One from Tanya asks, so does the change mean a focus on community colleges, support for micro-credentials, and alternative pathways? What does that look like with this new environment?
Yeah, I think we can just say yes to that, right? But I think because, and we saw this during the first Trump administration, and quite frankly, we've seen it throughout the Biden administration too. There is this recognition, and I think it's so again one of these things that's sort of permeating both sides, and I think it's obviously very applicable to apprenticeship. Is what are those alternative pathways outside of a 4-year degree, right? And differentiating apprenticeship from those other pathways, but what are they? And making sure that apprenticeship is one of those pathways. But
Uh-huh.
certainly, I think with this new administration, I think with this Congress, again, to the extent that they can focus on something outside of this big sort of tax and spending package that'll take up the bulk of this year, that is a question that these members are asking themselves. They're asking their stakeholders, they're asking their staff, they're asking their businesses. And so I think you are seeing that transformation. Like anything, though, it's been slow. There's certainly a slow burn there, but I do
Uh-huh.
think that we've seen again from the previous Trump administration efforts. What was that? I'm trying to think. Was it called like Council for the American Worker? There was a lot of different ideas and things kicked around with that entity that I know they had at least one, perhaps more reports that I thought was very well done, but honed in on that exact question, especially the bottom part, Tanya, which was alternative pathways. And I think that's where, we being, I see John now and Renee and the folks at AFA, and then of course all of you are working to position apprenticeships when it comes to that conversation, right? How do we make sure that that is mainstream, not just for policymakers, but for workers and their kids, right? Essentially, that's the workforce of the future that we need to
Yeah.
be
Yeah.
looking at. So, and especially, I mean, the news this week of an additional, student loan debt relief and forgiveness, like all of that inertia comes in when it relates to student debt, all those different those are really heavy things, Renee.
Yeah.
Um, but I think that we can come in and sort of create that as the differentiator when we look at what those alternative pathways are.
And then we had a related question from Shakina. With the new administration taking office, how do you foresee its policies impacting colleges that operate strictly as online learning institutions? Kind of related. What do you think there?
Yeah, I think there's certainly going to be, and again, a lot of this may come down to what the Department of Education looks like within this new administration. That's certainly a question that's been debated already quite a bit. But there's definitely going to be more um, a more receptive. This is a more receptive audience. So I would say maybe less skeptical of sort of online only. And again, I think there has been this false equivalency of online equals for profit.
Yeah.
And that's certainly something. I can say with, when Bernie Sanders was chair of the Help Committee, and some of you may be active in this issue around short-term Pell expansion, this issue around quality, you know, a lot of it came down to, brick and mortar, online, nonprofit, for profit. And we saw, quite frankly, some of that come through in some of the WIOA reauthorization consideration as well. But I think you're going to have a less schedule. But the fact is, if you're looking to expand alternative pathways to learning, then you
Uh-huh.
have to expand your your sort of sense of that traditional experience and allowing providers again with some quality metrics, and we saw some of that through some of the short-term Pell negotiations, because again that was another issue that was discussed at length but didn't get solved last Congress around putting sort of minimum metrics for providers, whether you're brick and mortar or online, it doesn't
Uh-huh.
matter, right? Meeting those minimum performance metrics before you're able to provide services under short-term Pell or something like that. I think that's sort of a common sense way to look at it from a policy perspective. And I
Uh-huh.
think it's something that for people in the field, stakeholders, if you're depending on what your role is, if you're placing participants or you're working, if you have some semblance on the front end of whether that program is going, if they have a strong track record of job placement, supports all this, if you know that on the front end, that to me that supports your outcome data on the back end. And so it's really hard to sort of and you again you can't predict these things 100%, but more easily predictable some of the outcomes if you have better inputs. And I think
Uh-huh.
that's what on the policy side Congress is looking at. I suspect that this administration will be looking at that as well.
Good deal. So I got three questions that are sitting here in the queue. Do you think that Republicans will look to restart IRAPs, and will they hold up other RA work in support of that effort?
I think that's what we're all expecting, right? Just based on where things were left at the previous administration, and then where things are coming in. It was really interesting. I know AFA, we as an organizational level, but also at the membership level, worked extensively with this current, again, 6-day administration, 6 days left administration on their proposed rules for the apprenticeship system, these apprenticeship enhancement regulations. The administration got a lot of, we'll just call it constructive feedback on their proposal, right? And so I think that from an administrative point of view, now again, for those that don't know, that proposal has been officially withdrawn, right? So that's not going to be moving forward. So
Yeah.
that sets out the opportunity for this new administration to come in and have a fresh look at apprenticeships. What has changed over 4 years? Again, I mentioned the incoming, potentially the nominee for Secretary of Labor. She was a strong supporter of the National Apprenticeship Act, which would essentially legislate the registered apprenticeship model. And so again, you're gonna have to square some of these round pegs. But in my mind, from a policy perspective, I have to think that there's a way that there's an ability for some coexistence here to have, and again, it goes back to the quality measures that we talked about before, because the equivalency that's been made by Democrats primarily on IRAPs is if you have an IRAP system, you don't have quality. And so making it, I think it helps all of us collectively if we're making apprenticeships easier to access for workers and businesses by also maintaining some of those quality metrics that are already baked in on the registered model. Is there a way we can figure that out? Because I mean, AFA members know this, we're falling behind the rest of the world. And we're in the United States of America. So we've got to be able to figure this out. From what I've heard, Renee, on some of the, whether it's different names or things for some of these other positions, it would seem to me that IRAPs are another real possibility again from a policy perspective. Then it comes down to that whole political question about because IRAPs were implemented during Trump 1.0, but then they were never funded by Congress, right? And so you do have to have that measure. And again, when Trump was elected in 2016, took office in
Mhm.
2017, Republicans had 240 House members. I mentioned earlier they have 220 now.
Yeah.
So much smaller majority. I already mentioned on appropriations, it's harder to get everybody together. So you have to rely on. So that gives Democrats, again, that gives Democrats some leverage if they don't like that IRAP approach to not allow that to be funded. And so I do think that from a policy perspective, you're
Hmm.
going to see an effort to make apprenticeship programs either easier to administer, access from both the worker or business side, or all the above. And the question becomes, is that going to be an opportunity, maybe using, working with the incoming Secretary of Labor if she's confirmed, um, on this to figure out a pathway forward? Because I don't want to speak for AFA or the members here, but like to have another lost 4 years on apprenticeship to me is not a good position for anyone to be in,
Yeah.
right? There's no reason and I think that that's sort of what happened, unfortunately, with apprenticeships during the first, is you had this, for a long time, we mentioned bipartisanship, Renee. Apprenticeship was one of those really bipartisan issues, and then we saw the fracture when with IRAPs and register and the registered model, and that didn't advance anything. That just had our feet in the mud for
Back in the
four
mud. Yeah.
years.
Yeah.
And so I think that for all of us collectively, we want to figure out a way that we can move forward, accomplishing all of those things.
Good deal. So, we've got about 5 minutes. I'm trying to get a couple of questions in here. One from Eloy. Now, he asked about what specific policies or initiatives, and he asked that before we started going to the vehicles. If there's any other vehicles that advance things for higher education or universities, please let us know. Thing that I think is really interesting that he noted here is addressing regional disparities. Is there anything on board to addressing regional disparities in access to job and training opportunities?
I think this is one of those areas where perhaps our member outreach can be impactful because, again, for the US, whether it's US DOL or US Department of Education, to have the pulse on some of these regional disparities, they're just not going to be able to do that. I think we collectively, if you bring them to AFA and John and Renee, or yourselves to your local delegations, we can then bubble those issues up. I will say, specific policies. I think what you're going to see is certainly more of a push, and we saw this in some of the WIOA reauthorization proposals last Congress, of more business involvement when it comes to higher ed. And when I say that, I don't just mean your traditional 4 year, but whether it's community college, other training program, things like that. So I think you're going to see some of that. But I do think that one of our advocacy and education roles can be identifying those regional disparities, but then also showcasing what we've done to overcome some of those things. Because I know that in regions in states across the country, these things come up, but we've been able to overcome them. And so a lot of times it gets mired in the muck here in DC, but on the ground, you don't have time for that, right? You've got constituents and people that need jobs and businesses that are hiring. And so what are those methods that have been particularly effective in your region, and how can we then help let the federal policymakers know about those best practices, and how can we then kind of pass that out to help our peers? That's going to be something that I think we as an organization can do effectively in this administration.
So AFA is a member organization um, growing. How can our members, or maybe I should say better, how can we serve our members with advocacy within the next administration and the next Congress? Any thoughts on how we can make that work effectively and that our members can help work through us?
I mean, I think a lot of it comes down to communication, Renee. I'm sure webinars like this, at least we hope, right? They're helpful to sort of engage people, but then also understanding where to go. And if they have a question, I will say this. I've worked with a lot of different, organizations over the years and, individuals, big companies, small groups, et cetera. And I know that if you haven't engaged with, some level of government in the past, that there can be some intimidation factor. I will say this, you're going to know from your role as a stakeholder, as a practitioner, as a leader, you're going to know a lot more about, in this case, apprenticeship, than probably somebody coming in from the outside to better understand what you're doing. And so having that confidence, but also then the ability to work with either you, Renee, or John and other folks at AFA, and of course with me too, is the ability to then communicate to the right people at the right time, uh, what it is exactly that we want them to hear, whether it is a good program, a good outcome, or good policy. And so that's certainly something that once you have your voice heard, you'll find that people start coming back to you and say, "Oh, okay, well, yeah, like you said," and Renee knew what he was talking about. I'm going to go back to him when I have something that comes up in workforce, on apprenticeship, or whatever it may be. And that relationship continues to carry itself forward, and that's really what a lot of my work tends to be, is on that relationship side. But locally speaking, you guys can have, you and your members can
Yeah.
have a much broader network for some of those other stakeholders that are going to be important to a congressman, a senator, or a state rep or a state senator, right? From that perspective.
So thank you for that, Chris. And I know there's two or three questions that we're not going to be able to get to just because of the constraints of time and respecting everyone's time. But I do want to thank you for sharing your insights here. And I do want to let folks know two things. One, again, for anyone who registered for this webinar, you will receive a copy of the recording of the webinar. Two, I want to reiterate that we do have a conference coming next month. Please go to apprenticeshipsforamerica.org and register. Members get a discount, and there are folks from Kale that are here. They also get a discount. We are really looking forward to seeing you there. And lastly, in 9 days, we will have another webinar. I mentioned we have a partnership with our friends at Kale. We're going to have a introducing each members to each other webinar on the 23rd of January. Everyone, thank you so much for joining us. Chris, thank you for your time and sharing your insights. Look forward to hearing from everyone and look for the recording in your mailboxes. Take care. Goodbye, everyone.
Thank you.
Hey, Renee, if you want to just keep the line open, I'll stick around in case there's
Yeah,
any after meeting conversation folks want to raise.
I'm saving the chat
All right, thank you.
and I'm going to stop the recording.